In 2019, South Park aired a few small jokes about how money buys silence, about the way big companies quietly edit themselves to keep one powerful government happy. That government answered within days. It reached into its own internet and erased the show from an entire nation, wiping every clip, every episode, every mention, until it was as if the show had never existed there at all. Then the men who made it did something stranger. They wrote that same government a thank you note, a fake apology soaked in sarcasm, welcoming the censors into their hearts and admitting they loved money more than freedom too. Erased by a superpower, they turned the whole thing into a punchline. That is one story. There are 9 more: the lost friends, the death threats, the furious celebrities, the lawsuits worth hundreds of millions, the angry churches, the grieving families, and the day the White House itself answered a cartoon. Welcome to East Park. Let's get into it. The Scientology War and the day Chef walked away. There is a version of South Park that lives in most people's heads, and in that version, the show is untouchable. It says the worst thing in the room and then strolls away whistling. It has made fun of presidents and prophets, of the famous dead and the famous living, of nearly every church and nearly every cause, and for most of its life, it has paid no real price for any of it. The joke lands, the outrage rises, and a week later there is a new episode and the cycle begins again. That reputation is mostly earned, yet it hides something quieter and a little sadder, which is that the show has, on a small number of occasions, actually lost something it could not get back. The first time that ever happened, the thing it lost was a friend. To feel the weight of that, it helps to settle in and remember who Chef was, because the loss makes no sense without him. For nearly the first decade of the show, Chef was the warm spot at the center of a very cold cartoon. He worked in the elementary school cafeteria. He wore an apron and a hairnet, and he was, in a town full of useless and selfish adults, the one grown-up the children could actually talk to. When the boys had a question they could not bring to their parents, they brought it to Chef. He would lean on the lunch counter, think for a moment, and then break into a slow, smooth song, usually one that drifted into something far too adult for the kids in front of him. The humor of the character came from that gap between his gentle voice and the things he was singing about. The heart of the character came from the fact that underneath all of it, he genuinely cared about them. What gave Chef that warmth was the man behind the microphone. The voice belonged to Isaac Hayes, and Isaac Hayes was not a small figure brought in to read cartoon lines. He was a soul legend. He had written and recorded music that shaped an entire era, including the theme that most people can still hum without knowing where it came from. He had a deep, unmistakable sound, the kind of voice that feels like it is sitting in the room with the listener. When the creators of South Park were first putting the show together, they reached out to him almost without expecting a yes. By later accounts from his own family, Hayes took the role mostly out of curiosity, to see where this strange little project would go. He never imagined it would become part of the culture the way it did. He came to love playing Chef. He loved the character, and he loved that people on the street recognized that famous voice and lit up when they heard it. That is the piece that makes everything else hurt. The man at the center of the first great South Park feud was, for years, one of the warmest presences the show ever had. Now, the show had a habit from the very beginning, and the habit was simple. It mocked religion, all of it. Christianity took the heaviest and most frequent hits, but nothing was off the table. Catholic figures, Mormon history, Jewish characters, the whole catalog of belief got pulled into the machine and turned into jokes. For a long time, the people who worked on the show seemed to operate by a rule that everything had to be fair game, that the moment one belief was protected, the whole project lost its nerve. And yet there was one religion they circled for years without ever landing on, and the reason was personal. The reason was Isaac Hayes. Hayes was, in his own life, a committed and outspoken Scientologist. The creators knew this. By Trey Parker's own later explanation, that knowledge is exactly what kept Scientology off the chopping block for so long. He has said that the thing holding them back was Hayes himself, that they knew he belonged to the church and they thought he was a wonderful man, so they simply left it alone. For a show that prided itself on having no sacred cows, that was a quiet act of loyalty to a colleague. It lasted until something pushed them over the line. The push, according to accounts of how the episode came together, came from outside the show entirely. The creators heard that a fellow entertainer, a magician and skeptic who hosted his own program built around debunking things, had wanted to take on Scientology on his own show, and had been blocked from doing it. The idea that a subject could be too dangerous to touch, that a religion could be powerful enough to keep itself out of a comedy program, was the exact kind of thing that made Parker and Stone want to run straight at it. So in 2000, 2005, in the 9th season of the show, they finally made the episode they had avoided for years. The episode was called Trapped in the Closet. Its plot was built around the character Stan, who takes a personality test, scores in a way the church finds remarkable, and is suddenly told that he is the reincarnation of the religion's founder. From there, the episode does something the show rarely bothered to do. It slows down and lays out in plain and patient detail the actual beliefs at the higher levels of the faith, the cosmic story that members are said to learn only after years inside. As it walks through that story, the screen carries a running note telling the audience that this is, in fact, what members of the church believe. The episode does not soften it. It presents the whole thing with a straight face, which is its own kind of attack, because a straight face invites the audience to laugh on their own. Real and famous members of the church were folded into the story. The episode built a long sequence around one of the most recognizable movie stars in the world, a man who locks himself inside a bedroom closet and will not come out, while the characters outside beg him to come out of the closet. The double meaning was not subtle, and it was clearly the point. Another major film star and a famous musician were drawn into the same plot. By the time the episode ended, it had done two things at once. It had explained the religion to millions of people who had never understood what it taught, and it had openly mocked some of its most powerful public faces. For most of the people targeted, that was simply another week of being a South Park punchline. For Isaac Hayes, it was something else. A few months after the episode aired, in early 2006, a statement went out announcing that Hayes was leaving the show. The statement framed his departure as a matter of principle. It said there was a place in the world for satire, but that there came a point where satire ended and intolerance and bigotry toward the religious beliefs of others began. It pointed to his long history as a civil rights activist and said that he could not, in good conscience, stay with a program that disrespected sincere belief. After roughly a decade as the soul of the show, Chef's voice was walking out the door, and the reason given was that the show had finally gone too far. The response from the creators was fast and sharp, and it did not pretend to be gentle. Matt Stone answered through the press and made the accusation plain. He said the decision had everything to do with Hayes' own faith. He pointed out that across 10 years and more than 150 episodes, Hayes had never once objected when the show went after Christians, after Muslims, after Mormons, after Jews. The complaint only arrived, Stone argued, when the show turned its attention to Scientology. In Stone's framing, Hayes was asking for a different standard for his own religion than the one he had happily accepted for everyone else's, and that double standard was, to Stone, the very place where intolerance actually began. It was a cold thing to say about a man who had spent years giving the show its heart, and Stone said it anyway. For years, that was where the story sat. A beloved cast member left in protest, the creators fired back, and the public filed it away as a falling out over a joke that cut too close. The fuller picture, which has come out slowly in the years since, is more complicated and a good deal more uncomfortable, and parts of it remain a matter of personal testimony rather than fully settled record, so it is worth treating with care. According to Hayes' son, the public version of events was not the true one. The son has said, in interviews and in a later public statement, that his father did not quit the show at all. He has explained that not long after the Scientology episode aired, his father suffered a serious stroke. The stroke, by the family's account, left Hayes unable to speak clearly or to make his own decisions, and he was in no condition to resign from anything or to write a careful statement about satire and intolerance. The son's claim is that someone within his father's circle, people connected to the same church, made the decision and quit the show on his behalf, and that the story about leaving over offense was a cover placed over the truth. By this account, the man at the center of the feud may never have chosen to leave, and the warm relationship between Hayes and the show may have been ended by people around him rather than by Hayes himself. The creators have, in later years, offered a memory that fits with this. Stone has recalled that Hayes came to see him a day or two after the episode aired, and that during that conversation, it seemed obvious someone had sent Hayes to ask them to pull it. Stone has also said that the show deliberately did not warn Hayes before the episode went out, so that he could not be blamed for it, a kind of cover for him. If those accounts are accurate, then the angry public split was sitting on top of a much quieter and more human story, one about a sick man, a powerful institution, and a friendship that got caught in between. The exact truth of who decided what and when comes from the family and from the creators rather than from documents, and so it lives in the space where memory and loyalty and grief all overlap. While that personal drama was unfolding, a second and more public fight was happening over the episode itself, and it pointed at one of the most famous men in the world. Not long after the episode first aired, the show's broadcaster in the United Kingdom removed it from the schedule, with reports at the time linking the decision to a wish to avoid legal trouble tied to the movie star the episode had mocked. A couple of months later, back in the United States, a planned rerun of the episode was suddenly pulled from the air. Reports that followed suggested that the star had used his influence to make that happen, and one widely repeated claim was that he had threatened to stop promoting a major upcoming film unless the episode disappeared. A representative for the actor denied that he had done any such thing, and the denial is part of the record too. What gave the rumor its teeth was a simple fact about who owned what. The studio behind that upcoming film and the network that aired South Park were, at the time, under the same corporate roof. The same parent company that stood to make a fortune from the movie also controlled the channel that carried the cartoon mocking its star. So when the rerun vanished, it was easy for people to imagine a single phone call traveling between two arms of the same business. Whether it happened exactly that way has never been proven, and the actor's side denied it, but the structure of the situation was enough to turn the disappearance of one rerun into a lasting story about money, power, and the limits of a show that claimed to have none. The show did not let any of it pass without an answer, and its answer doubled as a goodbye to the character it had lost. When the 10th season opened, the premiere brought Chef back to town, but something was wrong with him. In the story, Chef returns acting strangely, his mind apparently taken over by a shadowy group the episode invents for the occasion, a group designed to point straight at the kind of organization the creators felt had taken Hayes away. By the end of the episode, the character is killed off and the boys gather to mourn him. In their grief, they choose to remember him not as the strange figure he had become at the end, but as the kind, good-hearted man who had always looked out for them. The episode was stitched together in part from old recordings of Hayes, his real voice cut apart and rearranged so that Chef could speak a final time. It was a strange and bitter farewell, equal parts tribute and revenge, and it closed the door on the warmest character the show ever had. What was left behind was a quieter show. The cartoon survived the loss easily in terms of ratings and reputation, as it survived almost everything, but the specific thing Chef provided, the single adult who actually cared, was gone, and nothing quite replaced it. The first great South Park feud did not end with a clever comeback or a settled score. It ended with an empty chair at the lunch counter, a sole legend who may never have chosen to leave, and a fight over one episode that pulled in a movie star, a religion, and the company that signed everyone's checks. It was the first time the show learned that its jokes could cost it something real. It would not be the last person to walk away furious, and the next group to turn on the show would not go quietly into a cartoon death. They would pick up the phone, write the statements, and in a few cases, write the disses right back into their own work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Scientology fight cost the show its warmest voice and dragged a movie star, a religion, and a parent company into a single quiet war. But Chef was only one casualty among many. Next, the long line of famous faces the show turned into monsters, hand puppets, and gay fish, and the ones who fired back. Section 2. The Celebrity Ego Wars. There is a strange relationship between famous people and the shows that make fun of them, and South Park understood that relationship earlier and more clearly than almost anyone. Fame, the show seemed to grasp from its earliest days, tends to come with a soft spot. The more powerful a person becomes, the more carefully the world handles them, and the less practice they get at being laughed at. A cartoon that refused to handle anyone with care was always going to find that soft spot, lean on it, and watch what happened next. What happened, again and again, became one of the most dependable engines the show ever built. The pattern took a while to become obvious, but once it did, it never really changed. The show would take a celebrity, usually one near the peak of their power, and turn them into something absurd. A monster, a puppet, a fish. The parody itself was rarely the most interesting part. The most interesting part was what the famous person did afterward. Some of them laughed, some of them said nothing, and some of them lost their composure in public in a way that proved the show's point far better than the episode ever could. Over the years, the famous sorted themselves into roughly two camps, the ones who could take it and the ones who could not, and the show learned to feed on both. The very first big target arrived almost at the beginning, in the show's opening season, and she set the template for everything that followed. Barbra Streisand, one of the most celebrated performers of her generation, became the subject of an early episode built entirely around turning her into a villain. By accounts of how the episode came together, the choice was at least partly personal on the creators' side. They came from Colorado, and Streisand had reportedly spoken with open contempt about the state and vowed never to return to it. For two young men who had built a whole show around their home state, that was an invitation. In the episode, Streisand finds a mystical object and uses it to transform into a towering mechanical monster that stomps across the town like a creature from an old Japanese film. The threat is so large that it takes a bizarre team of other famous people to bring her her down. What followed was the first real test of how a celebrity would respond to being cartooned, and Streisand chose the serious route. Rather than laughing it off, she spoke about the show with real disapproval, criticizing what she saw as its cynicism and its negativity, and she seemed especially troubled that something so harsh was aimed at and absorbed by children. It was a measured, grown-up sort of objection, and it landed on two creators who were temperamentally incapable of letting a measured objection go unpunished. They did not back away or soften their approach. They kept her in their world for years, bringing the giant robot version of her back as a recurring gag, so that the more she signaled her distaste, the more permanent her cartoon monster became. The lesson of that first feud was simple and a little cruel. Taking the show seriously did not make it stop. Taking it seriously made it dig in. Tucked inside that same early episode was a quiet preview of the other kind of celebrity, the kind who would become rarer and more valuable as the years went on. To defeat the Streisand monster, the story brought in the real-life frontman of a famous rock band, drawn as himself and treated for once as a hero. Years later, when he was asked about seeing himself in the show, the musician was surprised by the whole thing, but seemed genuinely charmed by it, and he was especially pleased that one of the boys had used the moment to praise one of his band's most beloved albums. Here was the contrast, planted in the very first celebrity episode. One famous person turned into a recurring monster because she frowned, and another remembered fondly because he smiled. The show was already sorting people, and the people were sorting themselves. Years later, the show found another target who could not find the joke, and this time the parody was even more pointed. In a 2003 episode, the writers built a story around the pop star and actress Jennifer Lopez, who was at that point almost impossible to escape in the culture. The twist was that the real parody did not come from a careful impression. It came from Cartman's own hand. In the episode, Cartman draws a face on his hand, puts on a voice, and announces that his hand is now a pop superstar, complete with an exaggerated accent that leaned on tired and offensive ideas. The bit worked because it suggested that a global celebrity could be reduced to a crude puppet on a child's fist, and the world would not be able to tell the difference. The real Lopez, by the accounts that followed, was not amused by the comparison. And again, the show had its answer. The annoyance of the target was simply more fuel. By the time the show reached its 13th season, it had refined the celebrity feud into something close to a science, and the result was the most famous example of the entire form. The episode was called Fish Sticks, and on its surface, it is built around the dumbest possible joke. Two of the boys stumble onto a simple play on words, a pun about liking fish sticks that turns into a childish insult about being a certain kind of fish. The joke spreads across the whole country, and everyone finds it funny. Everyone, that is, except one person. The rapper and producer Kanye West is drawn into the episode as the only human being on Earth who cannot understand the joke. He hears it over and over, he watches everyone around him laugh, and he simply cannot grasp why it is funny, because grasping it would require him to see himself the way others see him. The episode turns into a careful, almost gentle dissection of a very specific kind of ego. The ego so large that it cannot process a small joke at its own expense. What made Fish Sticks legendary was not only the episode, it was what the real Kanye West did after it aired. Instead of staying silent, he went online and wrote about it directly, in a burst of capital letters, and his response was a strange and very human mix of wounded and self-aware. He admitted that the episode had hurt him. He also admitted that the show had a point, and he wrote that he had, in fact, been working on his own ego. For a brief moment, it looked like one of the show's targets had absorbed the lesson and grown from it, which almost never happens. And then, sometime later, a hint of the old bitterness surfaced anyway. In the lyrics of one of his songs, he slipped in a line about choking a South Park writer with a fish stick, a small, sharp reminder that the wound had not fully closed. That single arc, the parody, the honest public confession, and the quiet later flash of resentment, is probably the most complete picture the show ever produced of what it does to a famous person. It does not just mock them, it catches them in the act of reacting, and the reaction becomes the real portrait. Not every famous person walked into that trap, and the ones who avoided it became their own kind of legend among fans of the show. As the years went on, a growing number of celebrities decided that the smartest possible response to being cartooned was to enjoy it. When the show built an episode around the inventor and businessman who would later buy one of the largest social networks in the world, it imagined him buying a small handicapped boy's tiny transportation company for a sum in the billions, a number that now looks almost quaint next to his real later spending. His response was light and easy. He simply remarked online that it was a strange and trippy experience to see himself turned into a South Park character, and he moved on. There was no monster waiting for him in future seasons because there was nothing for the show to push against against. The same instinct saved other stars from the worst version of the joke. When the show decided to claim in one episode that a famous young singer was secretly the alter ego of one of its own middle-aged characters, the real singer chose to treat the whole thing as the compliment that being noticed by South Park actually is, and she responded with open amusement rather than anger. A member of a famous pop trio parodied early in his career over the squeaky clean image he and his brothers carried at the time, admitted years afterward that the episode had stung when it first aired, partly because so much was happening in his life at that moment. But he also said that the parody had grown on him with time, that he had come to find it funny, and that he had gone back and watched it more than once. A celebrated fantasy author turned into a running joke about his own obsessions and his fondness for killing off characters, took the ribbing with the good humor of a man who understood that being roasted at length is a sign of relevance, not an insult. The two camps, taken together, reveal the real shape of these feuds, and it is a shape that says as much about fame as it does about the show. The celebrities who suffered most were almost always the ones who could not laugh at themselves. The monster that would not die. The puppet on a child's hand. The man who could not understand a joke about himself. Each of those became a lasting image precisely because the real person responded with offense or confusion instead of a shrug. Meanwhile, the stars who let the parody roll off them tended to escape with nothing more than a funny clip and a story to tell. The show had stumbled onto a kind of truth about ego. The harder a person worked to protect their dignity, the more dignity the show could take, and the targets handed the writers their best material simply by refusing to be in on the joke. There is a reason these clashes feel different from the show's bigger and angrier scandals. No government got involved. No religion declared war. No cast member walked away. The celebrity feuds were smaller and more personal, a series of one-on-one contests between a cartoon and a famous person, and most of them ended not with lawsuits or bans, but with a single bruised reaction and a meme that outlived the argument. They were, in a sense, the show at its most playful, even when the play drew blood. The famous would keep arriving season after season, and the show would keep sorting them into the ones who could take it and the ones who could not. But there was one feud that did not fit either camp, because the target was not a person who could be turned into a monster or a puppet. The target was another show. And when South Park decided that a rival cartoon was lazy, cowardly, and beneath it, the fight that followed would last for the better part of 20 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Celebrity Wars showed a pattern, that the famous who could not laugh at themselves handed the show its sharpest weapons, while the ones who shrugged walked away clean. Next, the feud where the target fought back in its own episodes, the long and bitter rivalry with Family Guy and the manatees who supposedly write it. Section 3, Cartoon Wars and the long feud with Family Guy. For most of its life, South Park has treated other cartoons the way an older sibling treats the younger ones in the house. There is teasing, there is the occasional shove, and underneath it, there is usually a kind of grudging respect. When the show wanted to poke at the long-running animated giant that came before it, the one set in a yellow-tinted suburb, it did so with something close to affection. It built a whole episode around the idea that this older show had already done everything first, that no matter what wild plot the boys came up with, the elder cartoon had beaten them to it years earlier. The joke carried a tip of the hat inside it. The older show was a respected ancestor, and being compared to it was almost a compliment. There was one cartoon, though, that South Park did not treat like family. There was one show it seemed to genuinely look down on, and the contempt was not playful. It was real, it was personal, and it lasted for the better part of 20 years. The target was Family Guy, and the strange thing about the feud is that, from the outside, the two shows looked like cousins. On paper, they had a great deal in common. Both were animated comedies built around a crude suburban family. Both leaned on profanity, on shock, on the freedom that animation gives a writer to do anything at all. Both had been called offensive by the same kinds of critics. To a casual viewer flipping past either one, they might have seemed to belong to the same world. And that surface similarity is part of what made the rivalry so sharp, because the people who made South Park did not see a cousin when they looked at Family Guy. They saw a cheap imitation of the thing they were trying to do, a show that reached for the easy laugh while pretending to be in the same business as theirs. The closer two things look, the more the small differences start to matter, and Parker and Stone decided that the difference between the two shows was the whole point. The feud became public in 2006, during the show's 10th season, in a two-part episode whose very title announced that a war was underway. The story is remembered today for one image above all others, an image so strange and so specific that it has outlived almost everything else about the episode. In it, the audience learns the secret of how Family Guy is supposed supposedly written. The show, in this telling, is not written by people at all. It is written by a tank full of manatees. The gentle sea creatures swim around a pool filled with large balls, and each ball has a single word or a pop culture reference printed on it. To create a joke, a manatee nudges a few of these balls into a chute, more or less at random, and a machine stitches the words together into one of the show's signature cutaway gags. A household chore, a celebrity name, a country, a random object, all shoved together into a joke that has nothing to do with the story around it. The image was an insult, but it was a precise insult, and that precision was the real attack. South Park was not simply saying the rival show was bad. It was making a specific argument about how that show built its comedy. The complaint was about the cutaway gag, the quick flash to an unrelated scene that interrupts the plot for a laugh and then vanishes. To the makers of South Park, that style was a shortcut. Their own show, whatever else people thought of it, tried to build each episode around a single idea and to make the jokes serve that idea. The manatees were a way of saying that the other show had skipped all of that its jokes were interchangeable and could be swapped out at random without anyone noticing, because they were never connected to anything in the first place. Folded into the same two-part story was a second idea, a more serious one, that turned the episode into something larger than a simple takedown. The plot used as its engine a fictional story about a nervous television network and a planned cartoon depiction of a religious figure, and about the pressure to pull that cartoon before it could air. Cartman throws himself into the effort to get the rival show canceled, claiming to be acting out of concern. By the end, it becomes clear that Cartman does not actually care about the religious question at all. He simply hates Family Guy and its lazy writing, and he has used the controversy as a convenient way to attack a show he wants destroyed for entirely different reasons. The manatees themselves carry the deeper message. In the story, if even one ball is taken out of the tank, the manatees refuse to work, because in the logic of the episode, everything has to be allowed to be mocked or nothing can be. That single idea, that comedy cannot survive if some targets are placed off limits, was the principle the creators cared about most, and they had wrapped it inside their attack on a rival. Whatever message the episode carried, the people who made it did not hide behind it. On the commentary recorded for the home release, Parker and Stone dropped the cover of fiction and said plainly what they thought. They did not respect the rival show's writing. They felt its creative team reached for the laziest possible route to a joke. In later interviews, Trey Parker went further still and said outright that he hated the show. There was no softening, no claim that it had all been good-natured fun between colleagues. The venom was the point, and they let it show. The other show did not stay silent forever, though its response came slowly and in a different key. At first, the people behind Family Guy answered only in passing, joking on their own commentary tracks about their so-called manatee jokes, taking the insult and wearing it lightly. The real reply arrived a few years later, in 2009, buried inside one of their own episodes. In that story, two of the characters take part in an improv comedy show in front of a live crowd. One of them performs in the loose, anything-goes style that critics associate with Family Guy, throwing out absurd and disconnected bits, and the crowd loves it. The other character tries to steer the comedy towards something deeper, more careful, more built around character, the very approach South Park had praised in itself, and the crowd barely responds. The scene was quiet and easy to miss, but the argument inside it was clear. The rival show was answering the manatee insult by suggesting that its own messy, joke-first style actually worked on real audiences, while the supposedly smarter approach fell flat in the room. It was a counterpunch dressed up as a throwaway scene. Around the edges of the feud, there were small moments that revealed how differently the two sides carried it. By one account tied to the rival show, a major pop star who happened to be a devoted Family Guy fan, and who had herself been the target of a harsh South Park episode, went to the show's creator and asked him to make an episode that would strike back at South Park, with her appearing as a guest. The creator declined. He did not want to start a feud. That small refusal says a great deal about the shape of the whole rivalry. One side was eager to keep the fight going and treated it as personal. The other side, for the most part, kept trying to step back from it. The clearest window into that gap came in a later interview the rival creator gave, years after the Manatee episode. He admitted that he had found the South Park attack on his show funny and even accurate, that he could see the joke and appreciate the craft of it. What he could not understand was everything that came after the episode. The personal venom that Parker and Stone kept aiming at him in the press. The comments that had nothing to do with any joke and seemed instead to be aimed at him as a person genuinely baffled him. He pointed out that the two of them did not know him, that they had never really met, and he said it would be interesting to learn where all that vitriol actually came from. That confusion is the heart of the feud. For one side, side, it was a real grudge, carried for years and renewed in interview after interview. For the other side, it was a mystery, a stream of anger arriving from strangers who had decided to dislike him. There is one small detail that makes the whole thing even stranger. For all the years of attacks, the show never once put a clear cartoon version of the rival creator on screen as a target. The man who drew so much of the anger never got his own caricature, and the closest the show ever came was a minor writer character in the Manatee episode, who bore a passing resemblance to him. The feud, in other words, lived more in the commentaries and the interviews than in the episodes themselves. The episodes made an argument about a style of comedy. The bitterness was something the creators carried around outside the work and let out whenever a microphone was nearby. That bitterness sat in contrast with how the show treated its other animated neighbor, the older yellow-tinted one, which it kept casting as a respected elder rather than a rival. The difference was a choice. The makers of South Park were perfectly capable of treating another cartoon with warmth, and they did so for the show they admired. The venom aimed at Family Guy was specific and deliberate, reserved for the one show they had decided was beneath them. And then, after nearly 2 decades, the long Cold War began to thaw. In the quiet way these things sometimes do once the people involved have simply grown older. In recent comments, the rival creator spoke about South Park with something close to admiration, marveling that any show could last as long as it had and praising how sharply it stayed on top of the news. He noted the enormous difference in how the two shows are made, pointing out that his own program takes the better part of a year to produce a single episode, while South Park can turn one around in a matter of days, which lets it respond to the world almost as the world happens. Coming from a man who had spent years being baffled by their anger, it was a generous thing to say. There have even been recent reports suggesting that the two camps have, in some fashion, worked together behind the scenes, and that the old hostility has softened into something like a working peace, though the full shape of any such arrangement has not been laid out in detail in public. After 20 years, the manatees and their idea balls had become less a wound and more a shared piece of history. What the feud reveals in the end is that South Park's fights were never only with the famous and the powerful. Sometimes the show picked a fight with a peer simply because it could not stand the way that peer worked, and it carried that grudge far longer and far more personally than the original joke ever justified. It was a war fought over taste, over the right way to be funny, and it stayed warm for 2 decades because one side refused to let it cool. That fight, though, stayed within the family of artists and writers, a quarrel between people who made cartoons for a living. The next great conflict in the show's history would be nothing like it. It would not be about taste or comedy or ego at all. It would be about money, about contracts, and about hundreds of millions of dollars. And the people on the other side of it would not be rival writers. They would be the giant companies that owned the show itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Family Guy feud was a 20-year quarrel over taste, fought with manatees, idea balls, and a personal anger that puzzled the man on the other end until it finally cooled. Next, the fight turns to money, as 2 media giants drag the show into a courtroom battle over who really owns the right to stream it. Section 4, the $500 million streaming lawsuit. For most of its history, South Park aimed its anger downward and outward, at the powerful, at the rich, at the corporations that chase money without caring who gets hurt. The boys mocked greedy executives and soulless brands as a matter of routine. The show built whole episodes around the idea that big companies will do almost anything for a profit, and then, slowly and without quite meaning to, the show became one of those valuable things itself. It grew into a piece of property worth an enormous amount of money, and once that happened, it found itself pulled into a kind of fight it had never faced before. This time, the enemy was not a celebrity or a rival cartoon. This time, the fight was between 2 of the largest media companies on Earth, and the show was the prize they were fighting over. To understand how that happened, it helps to think about what the show actually is when you strip away the jokes. By the 2020s, South Park was not just a program that aired new episodes. It was a vault. More than 300 episodes, stretching back to the late 1990s, sat in that vault, and every one of them could be watched again and again. In the age of streaming, when companies were desperate to fill their new services with shows that people would actually return to, a deep and beloved library like that became something close to treasure. People do not only watch South Park once. They put it on in the background, they rewatch favorite seasons, they leave it running for hours. A catalog like that keeps subscribers paying month after month, and that reliability is exactly what the streaming companies craved. In 2019, the people who controlled those rights decided to cash in on that treasure. The creators, together with the company that had carried the show on television for decades, put the streaming rights up for auction. The winner of that auction was HBO Max, the new service being built by what was then Warner Media, which at the time sat under the telephone giant AT&T. The price was staggering. By the terms that later came to light in court, the deal was structured so that the buyer would pay close to $1.75 million for each episode, in exchange for the exclusive right to stream the show. The agreement covered the entire existing library, more than 20 seasons of it, and it reached forward to cover new episodes still to come. For a brief moment, the arrangement looked simple. One company aired the show first on television, another company held the exclusive right to stream it. Everyone had what they wanted. Then the world changed in a way no contract had planned for. The first new episodes covered by the deal were due to be delivered in the spring of 2020, and that spring brought the pandemic. Production on the show ground to a halt, like production on nearly everything else. The careful schedule of new seasons fell apart. The buyer that had paid all that money for fresh episodes was told that the new work was on hold. In place of the normal run of half-hour episodes, the show began producing something different, a small number of longer special episodes, made under the strange conditions of those years. The neat structure of the original deal had been knocked sideways, and into that confusion stepped a series of decisions that would eventually end up in front of a judge. While production was disrupted, the company that owned the television side of the show was busy building something of its own. In the spring of 2021, Paramount launched its own streaming service, Paramount Plus, and it needed exactly the kind of content that would make people sign up. A short while later, Paramount reached a separate and very large deal with the show, a deal reported to be worth around $900 million, to produce a run of new South Park specials. The catch, and the spark for everything that followed, was where those specials were going to live. They were going to stream on Paramount Plus, the service owned by the same company that aired the show on television. To the people who had paid a fortune for exclusive streaming rights at HBO Max, this looked like a betrayal hiding in plain sight. The other side did not let it pass. By early 2023, the company that now owned HBO Max, freshly merged and renamed Warner Brothers Discovery, took Paramount to court. The lawsuit asked for more than $500 million, and its core claim was simple to state even if the contracts behind it were not. Warner Brothers Discovery argued that it had paid for the exclusive right to stream new South Park content, and that Paramount had violated that exclusivity by funneling fresh South Park specials onto Paramount Plus instead. In its public statements, the HBO Max side did not soften the accusation. It described what it saw as a scheme that had run for years, a pattern of unfair business practices and deception in which Paramount and the studio arm tied to the show had repeatedly broken a contract that, in HBO Max's reading, plainly handed it the exclusive streaming rights to both the old library and the new work. The argument was that the show's new owner had been quietly starving HBO Max of the very content it had paid so dearly to lock down in order to feed its own young streaming service. Paramount rejected all of it. Its position was that the claims had no merit, and it told a very different version of the same events. In Paramount's telling, it had kept its end of the bargain, continuing to deliver new South Park episodes to HBO Max even as the dispute heated up. It then turned the accusation around. Paramount filed its own claim, a countersuit seeking around $52 million, arguing that Warner Brothers Discovery had failed to pay licensing fees it owed for episodes that had already been handed over, and that HBO Max was, at that very moment, still streaming. So each side accused the other of breaking the deal. One company said its exclusive content was being stolen away to a rival service. The other company said it was being cheated out of the money it was owed for the episodes it had faithfully supplied. The show that had spent decades mocking corporate greed now sat at the center of a courtroom argument in which two corporations accused each other of exactly that. What followed was the slow, grinding process that these cases always become. The fight did not resolve in a single dramatic moment. It moved through filings and hearings and rulings, the kind of legal back and forth that takes years and rarely produces a clean answer. Late in 2023, a judge narrowed the scope of the larger lawsuit, trimming back some of what Warner Brothers Discovery could pursue. That looked for a time like a setback for the HBO Max side, but the case did not die. Early in 2025, another ruling went the other way, upholding the grounds on which Warner Brothers Discovery had built its claim and clearing a path toward an actual trial. The two giants remained locked together, each convinced it had been wronged, the dispute dragging on with no quick end in sight, the show itself sitting quietly in the middle while lawyers argued over what it was worth and who had the right to it. While the courtroom fight ground forward, the situation on the ground resolved itself in a way that was easy for ordinary viewers to see. The streaming arrangement that had kept the show on HBO Max was tied to a deal that had a limit on it, and in 2025, that limit was reached. The deal with the company that handled the show's rights expired, and the consequences arrived fast. The classic episodes that fans had grown used to finding on HBO Max began to vanish from the service. On a day in early August of 2025, the show officially left HBO Max altogether. Every episode, old and new, came to rest on a single home instead. From that point forward, the entire run of South Park streamed exclusively on Paramount+, the very service whose rise had helped trigger the lawsuit in the first place. The treasure had been pulled back home, and the rival that had paid so much for it was left with an empty shelf and a case still pending in court. The show, for its part, could not resist commenting on the whole strange situation, because commenting on the world is the only thing it has ever really done. Even before the lawsuit became public, the creators had built a special around the streaming wars themselves, turning the frantic competition between services into the subject of an entire story. The economics of streaming, the desperate hunger of these companies for content, the way ordinary shows had become weapons in a war between corporations, all of it became material. There is a heavy irony in that, and the show seemed fully aware of it. A program that had become a $500 million asset, fought over by media empires, turned around and made jokes about exactly the kind of greed that had turned it into a battlefield. The boys who had spent years mocking the love of money were now the money, and they knew it. That is the part worth sitting with. South Park began as a cheap, crude little cartoon made by two young men who delighted in attacking anyone with power. It mocked corporations as faceless and greedy. It treated executives as villains who would sell anything and anyone for a profit. And then, by simply surviving and being good at what it did for so long, it became one of the most valuable properties in television, the kind of asset that companies spend a fortune to own and then sue each other over when they feel cheated. The show did not change its values to get there. It kept making the same jokes it always had, but its sheer endurance turned it into something it once would have mocked, a prize so valuable that grown men in suits would fight over it in a courtroom for years. The lawsuit between the two media giants was, in a sense, a fight about the show that the show was barely allowed to be part of. The creators were not the ones suing or being sued. The companies that owned the rights did that, arguing over contracts and exclusivity and unpaid fees, while the show kept airing new episodes through it all. For once, the conflict was happening above the heads of the people who actually made the thing. They had built the asset, and now the owners of the asset were at war over it. That distance, though, would not last. The corporate world around the show was about to shift again, in a way far bigger than one lawsuit between two companies. A new and even larger deal was coming, one that would change who controlled the show's corporate parent entirely. And when that change arrived, the creators would not stay quietly above the fray. They would step directly into the fight, say exactly what they thought of the people now in charge of their show, and then take their revenge in the only place they truly controlled, which was the show itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The streaming lawsuit turned the show into a $500 million prize that two media giants fought over in court for years, until the whole library finally landed on a single service. Next, the creators stopped watching from above and joined the war themselves, calling their own corporate merger a mess and then taking their revenge on air. Section 5. Biting the hand that feeds. There is a kind of fight that is harder and stranger than all the others, and it is the fight you have with the people who pay you. A celebrity can be mocked from a safe distance. A rival show can be attacked across the airwaves with no real cost. Even a giant media company suing another giant media company is, in the end, a battle fought somewhere above the heads of the people who actually make the work. But every now and then, a creator turns around and aims at the very hand that feeds them, at the company that signs the checks and owns the platform and could, in theory, end everything with a single decision. That is the most reckless feud of all, because losing it can mean losing the whole show. In 2025, the people behind South Park picked exactly that fight, and they did it in the boldest way imaginable. To see why, it helps to understand the strange position the show found itself in by the middle of that year. The company that owned Comedy Central, the channel that had carried the show since the beginning, was itself being swallowed up. Paramount, the corporate parent of the show, was in the middle of a massive sale, a merger that would hand control of the whole empire to a new set of owners from a company called Skydance, backed by one of the wealthiest families in entertainment. For the people who made South Park, this was not distant business news. It was a question of who their bosses would be, what their contract would look like, and whether the show even even had a clear future. The ground under the entire operation was shifting, and the men who made the show did not like the feeling of it at all. So they said so, out loud, in public, in a way that creators almost never do about the company that owns them. As the merger ground forward, Parker and Stone put out a blunt message. They called the whole situation a disaster, and they said plainly that it was messing up their show. They added that they were sitting in the studio working on new episodes, and that they hoped their fans would somehow get to see them, as if they themselves were not sure that would happen. It was a remarkable thing to admit. The men who made one of the most valuable shows on television were telling the world that the corporate chaos around them had thrown their own work into doubt. There was no polished statement, no reassuring corporate language. There was just frustration, aimed squarely at the people in charge of their future. The frustration had real consequences for the audience too. The new season, which fans had been waiting on for a long stretch, did not arrive when it was supposed to. The premiere was pushed back by about 2 weeks, delayed while the contracts and the negotiations sorted themselves out behind closed doors. The show could not simply go on air because the business around it had not been settled, and the people who made it were openly unhappy about being caught in that limbo. Behind the scenes, what was actually happening was a fight over enormous sums of money. By accounts of the negotiations, the streaming rights to the show had become the subject of a long bidding war, with more than one company circling, each one wanting to be the home of that valuable library and the new episodes to come. When the dust finally settled, the result was a deal of staggering size. The creators reached an agreement reported to be worth around $1.5 billion. The terms called for 50 new episodes to be made over the next 5 years, and for the entire run of the show to stream on Paramount+. After months of public anger and private war, the men who had called the merger a disaster had signed one of the largest deals in the history of television, with the very company they had been fighting. That alone would have been a strange enough ending. A bitter public dispute with their corporate parent had concluded, with a fortune changing hands and a long future secured. Most creators, having just been handed that kind of money and that kind of security, would have smiled, said thank you, and gone quietly back to work. What Parker and Stone did instead is the reason this feud belongs in its own chapter. They took the money, and then almost immediately, they used the platform that money had bought to humiliate the company that had paid them. The context for that revenge matters, because the show was reacting to a specific pattern of behavior it found shameful. In the run-up to the merger, Paramount had made a series of decisions that, to many observers, looked like a powerful company bowing to political pressure to clear the path for its sale. The company had agreed to pay a large settlement, reported at around $16 million, to resolve a lawsuit brought by the sitting president over the editing of a news interview, a settlement that critics saw as a payment made to smooth the way for the deal rather than a genuine admission of wrongdoing. Soon after, the company's broadcast network announced that it was canceling the long-running late-night show hosted by Stephen Colbert. The network called the move a simple financial decision, but the timing set off alarm bells, coming as it did just days after Colbert had openly criticized his own corporate parent for that very settlement. And many people concluded that a comedian was being quietly removed for mocking the powerful at an inconvenient moment. To the men who made South Park, a show built from the ground up on the principle that no one should be safe from mockery, this was exactly the kind of cowardice they despised. A company caving to power, a network silencing a comic to protect a business deal, and the company doing it was now their company, the one that had just promised them a fortune. So they answered the only way they knew how. The same week they signed that enormous deal, the new season opened with an episode that turned its corporate parent into a target. The episode wove the real-world situation directly into its story. In the plot, the town faces a lawsuit from the president and has to decide whether to fight it or to settle. At the moment of decision, it is the character of Jesus who steps in and urges the town to give up and settle rather than risk everything. The reasoning he gives is pointed and unmistakable. He reminds the town what happened over at the network, and he names the company behind it, the very company that owned the show airing those words. He invokes the canceled late-night host by name, warning that anyone who fights the powerful will simply end up erased the way that comedian was. The message inside the cartoon was the message the creators were sending to their own bosses, broadcast on a service those bosses owned. The town, in the end, agrees to settle, and even agrees to produce flattering messages praising the very power it had been afraid of. The show was acting out, in its own twisted way, exactly the kind of surrender it accused its parent company of making. Sit with the audacity of that for a moment. A company had just agreed to pay these two men something on the order of $1.5 billion to keep making their show and to stream it on the company's own platform. platform. And the first thing the two men did with that platform was to accuse the company, by name and on its own service, of being a coward that silences comedians and pays off the powerful to protect its business. They bit the hand that fed them while the hand was still extended, while the ink on the deal was barely dry. It was a feud waged not despite the money, but practically on top of it. Observers who follow the show closely saw a deeper game in the move. By some readings of the situation, the mockery was not only about principle, it was a kind of pressure, a deliberate needling of a company that was desperate to keep its merger on track and to avoid offending the powerful figures whose approval it needed. The creators in this view understood that they now held a strange kind of power. Their show was too valuable to cancel and too independent to control, and they could use it to embarrass the very people who owned it, almost daring them to do something about it. Whether that reading is fully accurate or whether the creators were simply doing what they have always done, attacking hypocrisy wherever they find it, is something only they truly know, and they have never laid out their exact motives in plain terms. But the effect was the same either way. The show had become powerful enough to make its own bosses uncomfortable, and to face no consequence for it. This was not, in truth, the first time the show had turned on its corporate masters. Over the years, it had poked at its networks and owners more than once, building entire stories around the greed of the streaming business and the desperation of the companies fighting over content. The instinct to bite the hand had always been there. What made the 2025 episode different was the scale and the timing. Never before had the stakes been so high, the payday so large, or the target so directly the people who had just secured the show's future. It was the boldest version of a move the creators had been making, in smaller ways, for a very long time. What the whole episode reveals is something essential about how these two men operate, and about why the feuds on this side of the story all share a single thread. They do not seem to recognize the normal rules of self-interest. A celebrity who insults them gets turned into a monster. A rival show that earns their contempt gets attacked for 20 years. A company that pays them a fortune gets mocked on its own platform for cowardice. The common thread is a refusal to make anyone safe, including themselves, including their own employers, including the source of their own wealth. The hand that feeds is, in their world, just another hand, and if it does something they find shameful, it gets bitten like any other. That refusal is what powered every feud in this half of the story. The loss of a beloved friend over a religious joke, the long line of furious celebrities, the bitter war with a rival cartoon, the $500 million courtroom fight between giants, the decision to mock their own corporate parent while pocketing its money. All of it comes from the same place, a stubborn insistence that nothing and no one is off limits, no matter the cost, no matter who gets hurt, including the people holding the checkbook. But there is a hard limit to that philosophy, and the show ran straight into it. Mocking a celebrity carries no real danger. Mocking a company risks money and contracts, but money and contracts can be survived. There is, however, a kind of enemy that cannot be mocked into submission, an enemy that does not respond with an angry tweet or a lawsuit, but with something far older and far more frightening. When the show aimed its jokes at certain beliefs held by certain people in certain corners of the world, the response was not outrage on a talk show. The response was a threat against the lives of the men who made it, serious enough that for the first time, the show's own network covered its eyes and refused to let the audience hear what the creators had to say. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Biting the hand that feeds, the creators took a fortune from their corporate parent and then used that same platform to brand the company a coward, the boldest feud in a long history of sparing no one. Next, the story turns to the scandals, beginning with the one fight that answered jokes with death threats and made a network too frightened to air the ending. Section 6. The Muhammad episodes and the death threats. Up to this point, the story has been about fights that could be survived. A celebrity could rage and then fade. A rival show could trade insults across the years. A company could be sued or mocked, and the show would simply keep airing the next week as if nothing had happened. Every enemy in that first half of the story shared one quiet quality. None of them could truly stop the show, and none of them ever made the men who made it fear for their lives. The scandals are different. They begin in a darker place, and the first of them is the darkest of all, because the answer to a cartoon drawing was a threat to kill the people who drew it. It is a strange thing to sit with, the idea that a few seconds of animation could become a matter of life and death. South Park had spent years drawing the sacred and the powerful with a careless hand. It had drawn the figure at the center of Christianity as a regular character who hosted a talk show. It had drawn the founder of one faith and the central figures of another without a second thought. Mockery of belief was simply part of the machinery, as ordinary on this show as a fart joke, and for a long time, one particular religious figure was treated exactly like all the others, with no special caution and no special fear. That figure was the Prophet Muhammad, and the story of what happened when the show drew him is the story of how the wider world slowly made one image too dangerous to put on screen. To understand why a single drawing carried so much weight, the story has to widen out beyond the show for a moment. In many Islamic traditions, any visual depiction of the Prophet is considered deeply wrong, a line that must not be crossed. For most of the show's early life, that belief existed in the background of the wider culture without erupting into the open. Then, in the years around the middle of the 2000s, it erupted with terrible force. A newspaper in Denmark published a set of cartoons depicting the Prophet, and the reaction spread across the globe. There were protests in many countries, there were riots, embassies were attacked, people died. A few years later, drawings by another European artist set off a similar wave of threats. Long before any of that, a famous author had spent years under the shadow of a religious order calling for his death over a novel. By the time the show returned to the subject, drawing the Prophet was no longer a quiet matter of taste. It had become, around the world, a question that some people were willing to kill over. What makes the show's history with this subject so striking is that it began without any drama at all. Back in 2001, in its 5th season, the show aired an episode that gathered the founders and central figures of the world's great religions into a single team of superheroes, banding together to fight a threat. Among them, drawn plainly and treated with no more or less respect than the others, was Muhammad. He appeared on screen, openly and uncensored, as one hero among many, and nothing happened. There was no protest, no threat, no firestorm. The world had not yet been primed to treat that image as a trigger, and so the episode passed into the show's library like any other. It stands now as a quiet snapshot of a moment that was about to end, the last time the show could draw that figure without consequence. By the time the show came back to the subject in 2006, the air had changed completely. The Danish cartoons had happened. The world had seen what a single drawing could set off. And when the show built a story that involved depicting the Prophet again, the people who carried the show, the network itself, lost their nerve. Comedy Central refused to allow the image to appear. Where the figure should have been, the screen instead showed a flat message announcing that the network would not broadcast the picture. The creators, who had drawn the same figure 5 years earlier without anyone blinking, now found their own platform stepping in to stop them. This was the first crack, the first sign that a fear larger than the show had arrived, and was beginning to shape what it could and could not say. The frustration that grew out of that moment would set the stage for the much larger collision to come. That collision arrived in 2010, in the show's 14th season, in a 2-part episode made to celebrate its 200th installment. The story was built fittingly as a kind of reunion of everyone the show had ever angered, a gathering of past targets who wanted revenge. At the center of the plot was a peculiar idea. The angry celebrities come to believe that the Prophet Muhammad possesses a special power, the power to be completely immune from ridicule, untouchable in a way no one else is. They want that power for themselves, so that they too can be safe from mockery forever. That idea was the real argument the show was making, hidden inside the cartoon logic. The show was pointing at a double standard it found impossible to ignore. Every other sacred figure could be drawn and mocked and joked about, but this one figure had been placed behind a wall of fear, and the show wanted to ask out loud why that one exception existed and what it cost. To make the point, the episode kept the figure hidden, first inside a bear costume, and later behind a large black box that simply read "censored." Then came the threat that turned a comedy into a genuine danger. Before the second half of the 2-part story aired, a radical group posted a warning online aimed directly at the two creators. The message said that the men risked being murdered for what they had done, and it reached for the most chilling possible example to make its point. It invoked the name of a Dutch filmmaker who, a few years earlier, had been killed in the street after making a film that criticized the treatment of women in some Islamic societies. The warning suggested that the creators would likely meet the same end. To remove any doubt about how serious the moment was, the Post also published the street addresses of the network's office and the studio where the show was made, placing the exact locations of the people who worked there into public view. The author of the Post insisted it was not a threat, but only a warning of what was likely to happen. The distinction offered no comfort to anyone whose home or workplace had just been pinned to a map by people praising a murder. The network reacted the way frightened institutions usually do. It chose safety over the show. When the second episode aired, Comedy Central had cut into it heavily. Every spoken reference to the Prophet was bleeped out, replaced by a wall of beeps that buried the dialogue. The figure figure himself stayed hidden behind the censored box. The episode was kept off the network's website entirely, and then came the part that turned the whole affair into something larger than a single religious controversy. The episode ended, as the show's episodes often do, with a closing speech, a final moment where a character steps forward to deliver the point of the whole story. This particular speech was about intimidation. It was about fear, and about how giving in to people who threaten violence only teaches them that violence works. The network bleeped that speech too. It silenced the entire ending, drowning the show's actual message under a long stretch of meaningless noise, so that the audience never got to hear what the show had been trying to say. There is a terrible perfection to what happened there, and it is the heart of why this scandal still matters. The speech that got silenced was a speech warning against exactly this kind of silencing. It argued that fear should not be allowed to decide what people are permitted to say, and the response to that argument was to make sure no one could hear it. The creators were careful afterward to make one thing clear. The wall of bleeps was not their idea, and it was not some clever joke on their part about censorship. The network had done it to them, against their wishes, out of fear. They said that across all their years of making the show, they had never once put out an episode they could not stand behind, and this was no exception. The work they had made and the work the audience saw were two different things, and the difference had been carved out by people who were afraid. The fear did not stop with the bleeps. In the time that followed, both halves of the two-part episode quietly disappeared. They were pulled from the streaming services, removed from reruns, and left off the home video releases. Episodes that had aired on national television, that had been watched by millions, simply ceased to be available, scrubbed out of the official record as if they had never existed. The fear even reached backward in time. The old episode from 2001, the one where the same figure had appeared with no trouble at all, was pulled as well, banished alongside the newer ones. A piece of the show's history vanished, not because of anything new it had done, but because the world around it had decided years later that it could no longer be allowed to exist. And in a final strange twist, the same two episodes that the network had been too frightened to air in full went on to earn a nomination for one of television's highest honors that same year, praised by the industry even as they were buried by the people who own them. The show was not entirely alone in that frightening stretch, though the support it received told its own grim story. The older animated series that South Park had always treated as a respected elder offered a quiet message of solidarity tucked into one of its own episodes. In a small written gag, the older show said it would stand beside South Park, except that it was too scared to do so. It was a joke and it got a laugh, but underneath it was an honest admission. Even another long-running, fearless cartoon was afraid to publicly back a peer over this one subject. That is how heavy the fear had become. The danger was real enough that solidarity itself had to hide behind a joke about cowardice. Voices outside the show warned that the network had made a serious mistake, and their warning has echoed ever since. The argument was straightforward. When a powerful company gives in to a threat of violence, it does not make the threat go away. It teaches the people making threats that the strategy works, and it invites more of the same. Every group that wants something silenced now has proof that fear can deliver it. By caving so visibly, the critics argued, the network had not protected free expression at all. It had quietly handed a small measure of power to anyone willing to threaten harm, and set a precedent that would be hard to undo. The show had spent years insisting that everything must be open to mockery or nothing truly is. And here was the real world testing that idea, and in the eyes of many, failing it. What lingers about this scandal is how different it was from everything that came before it. The feuds were loud and personal, and in their way, almost fun. Contests of ego and money that the show always seemed to win in the end. This was something else. Here, for the first time, the show ran into a force it could not mock, sue, or outlast. The threat was anonymous and serious, the kind that turns a studio address into a target. And for the first time, the show's own protectors covered the audience's ears, deciding that a message about fighting fear was itself too frightening to broadcast. The scandal was never really about whether a cartoon should draw a religious figure. It was about who gets to decide what can be said, and what happens when the people who own a platform decide that the safest choice is silence. The show survived, as it always does, but a part of its work was taken from it and locked away, and it has stayed locked away ever since. That was a threat that came from no single place, from a scattered group hiding behind anonymous warnings. The next time the show was erased on a massive scale, the force behind it would not be a faceless mob at all. It would be one of the most powerful governments on Earth, acting on the whole country at once, wiping the show from an entire nation's internet because of a few jokes about who really controls what the world is allowed to watch. Before we move on, if you're enjoying enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Muhammad episodes turned a cartoon into a target, drew real threats against the creators, and ended with a frightened network silencing a speech about the danger of silence itself. Next, the show takes on an entire government, mocks the way money buys obedience, and watches a nation of more than 1 billion people erase it overnight. Section 7. Banned in China. There is a difference between being threatened and being erased. A threat is loud. It arrives with a name attached, or at least a voice, and it leaves room for defiance, for the target to stand up and refuse to be cowed. Erasure is quieter and, in its own way, far stranger. It does not argue or warn. It simply removes the thing from the world and acts as though it was never there. The previous scandal had taught the show what a threat felt like, the kind that turns a studio address into a target. The next one taught it something colder. It taught the show what it felt like to be made to vanish, not by a scattered group of anonymous extremists, but by one of the most powerful governments on Earth, acting across an entire nation at once. By the year this happened, the show had settled into a new rhythm. It had drifted away from its old structure of separate, self-contained episodes and had begun building longer arcs around the father of one of the boys, a man whose endless schemes had become the engine of whole seasons. But the deeper subject the show kept circling in those years was bigger than any one character. It was about money, and specifically about the quiet ways that money bends people and companies into shapes they would never admit to choosing. And in 2019, the show found the perfect example of that quiet bending, sitting in plain sight in the relationship between American business and the enormous market of China. The setup for the whole affair sounds too absurd to be real, and yet every piece of it is. For years, a strange political fact had been hardening inside China. People online had begun comparing the country's leader to a gentle, pudgy cartoon bear, the soft-spoken honey lover from old children's stories. The comparison started as a harmless joke, the kind of thing that spreads because it is funny and a little true, but the government did not find it funny. Over time, images of that innocent bear were scrubbed from the Chinese internet, blocked and filtered out, because a children's character had somehow become a way for people to mock a head of state without saying his name. Even a film built around that bear was reportedly kept out of Chinese theaters. A cartoon bear, the most harmless thing imaginable, had become politically dangerous. That single absurd truth became the seed of the entire episode. The show planted that seed in a story it called, with its usual bluntness, an episode about a band in China. The episode ran 2 storylines side by side, and both of them were really about the same thing. In the first, some of the boys form a heavy metal band and decide to make a movie about themselves. A film producer they meet lays out the rules of modern entertainment in a way that is meant to sting. For the movie to make real money, he explains, it has to be approved by Chinese censors, which means it cannot contain anything that those censors dislike. He runs through the forbidden list, and the list is pointed. The film may not mention the exiled spiritual leader China refuses to recognize. It may not include anything about being gay. It may not touch on the dark accusations surrounding organ transplants. And it certainly may not include the cartoon bear. The boys, wanting the money, begin shaping their own story to fit the rules. And in doing so, they become a small cartoon version of every Hollywood studio quietly editing itself to please a foreign government. The second storyline went much darker, and it is the one that drew the most attention. In it, the father character travels to China to expand his marijuana business into that vast market. He is quickly arrested and thrown into a labor camp, a clear reference to the real detention camps that China has used against certain populations. Inside, he is handed a card and made to read from it, declaring himself a proud and loyal member of the ruling party, and announcing that the party matters more than any individual. He witnesses casual brutality, and there, in the camp, he meets the gentle cartoon bear and his small pink friend, both of them imprisoned too, with the little pig explaining that they became illegal once people noticed how much the bear resembled the country's leader. The episode then drives toward a grim climax in which the father, desperate to win access to the Chinese market for his product, does something genuinely monstrous to that beloved bear. The point is ugly and deliberate. The show was arguing that American companies would commit almost any betrayal, would crush almost anything precious for the reward of selling into that market. The brutality was the message. What made the timing of all this feel almost supernatural was a real-world scandal unfolding in the very same days in a completely different corner of American life. A senior figure in a major basketball team had posted a short message online supporting the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The reaction from China was swift and punishing. The country moved to pull the league's games from its airwaves, putting an enormous, lucrative business relationship at risk over a single tweet. And the league, faced with losing access to that market, scrambled to smooth things over, issuing careful statements that many Americans read as an apology for someone daring to support freedom. The sight of a beloved sports league appearing to choose money over principle in real time was exactly the hypocrisy the show had just been an episode attacking. Reality had handed the show a perfect living illustration of its own argument right as the episode aired. Then came China's answer to the episode, and it was total. According to the reports that emerged, the Chinese authorities did not bother to argue with the show or condemn it. They simply made it disappear. Across the country's streaming services, the episodes and clips were deleted. Across social media, mentions of the show were wiped away. People searching one of the largest Chinese platforms reportedly found no trace of the show across billions of past posts, as though it had never been discussed by anyone. On the popular forums, threads about the show were replaced with a cold notice explaining that the section was, for now, closed. On the rating sites, searches turned up nothing. The show that had spent more than 2 decades being impossible to silence in its own country had, in another country, been quietly and completely erased. The government behind it offered no public explanation, and the bodies that oversee the internet there did not respond to questions. The show was simply gone. The creators did not respond to this the way they had responded to the death threats. There was no fear this time, no frustration, no sense of being cornered. There was, instead, something close to delight. A few days after the ban became clear, they posted what they called an official apology to China, and every line of it was soaked in sarcasm. They wrote that, just like that basketball league, they welcomed the Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts. They wrote that they too loved money more than they loved freedom and democracy. They added, with a wink, that the country's leader looked nothing at all like the cartoon bear, mocking the very comparison that had caused so much trouble. They plugged their upcoming 300th episode, and they closed with a few absurd flourishes, a cheer for the ruling party, and a hope for a bountiful harvest, before asking, with mock innocence, whether everything was good now. The apology was not an apology at all. It was a second attack, aimed at China and at the cowardly companies appeasing it, dressed up in the language of surrender. The reason the whole affair landed so cleanly comes down to a single advantage the show had that almost no one else in entertainment did. The big studios, the streaming giants, the sports leagues, all of them had something enormous to lose. They wanted into the Chinese market, or they were already in it, and that desire gave the censors power over them. It made them careful. It made them edit themselves before anyone even asked. The show had no such weakness. It was never going to be sold in China. It had no theaters to fill there, no subscribers to win, no relationship to protect. Being banned cost it nothing, and that freedom is exactly what let it say the thing that everyone else was too compromised to say out loud. The episode worked because the people who made it were the only ones in the room with nothing to lose, and they knew it. There is a clean lesson buried in that, and it is the opposite of the lesson from the death threats. When the show faced a danger that could actually reach it, a threat against the lives of the men who made it, its own network covered the audience's ears, and a real cost was paid. When the show faced a danger that could never reach it, a foreign government an ocean away, it laughed and made the ban into a punchline. The difference was distance. The threat that could not touch them became material. The threat that could touch them became silence. The China episode was the show at its most fearless, precisely because, in that one case, fearlessness was free. The erasure also did nothing to slow the show down. Around the same time, it had been renewed for several more seasons, secure as one of the longest-running animated series ever made. The ban, far from hurting it, became one of the most talked about things it had done in years, praised widely as a rare moment of an entertainment company refusing to bow. The show had been deleted from the internet of more than 1 billion people, and the only real effect was to make it look braver than everyone around it. A government had tried to make the show vanish, and the attempt became a badge of honor. What the China scandal proved is that some enemies, however vast and powerful, simply cannot hurt a show that does not want anything from them. A nation of more than 1 billion people erased the show overnight, and the show shrugged, made a joke, and moved on to its next episode without losing a thing. Distance was a kind of armor. The censors could delete every clip and scrub every mention, but they could not reach into another country and stop the next episode from airing, and they could not take a single dollar the show actually depended on. From that safe distance, the show was untouchable. But not every angry party was so far away, and that is what made the next kind of scandal more dangerous in its own quiet way. The fury that came from foreign governments and faceless mobs arrived from across oceans and borders, where the show could mock it freely. The fury that came from organized groups inside its own country was a different matter. Those groups could write to the network. They could pressure the company that owned the show. They could reach the very people who decided what stayed on the air and what quietly disappeared. And no group learned to apply that pressure more effectively or took more lasting offense at how the show treated its deepest beliefs than the religious organizations who felt that their faith had been dragged through the mud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The China ban showed the show at its most fearless, erased by an entire government, yet free to laugh because it wanted nothing that government could take away. Next, the anger moves closer to home, to the religious groups who were offended deep in their faith and who could actually reach the people deciding what stayed on the air. Section 8. When the church came knocking. The dangers that came from far away had a strange kind of safety built into them. A foreign government could erase the show from its own internet, but it could not stop the next episode from airing at home. A scattered group of extremists could post a frightening warning, but they were faceless and distant, and the show could draw strength from defiance. The threats that traveled across oceans and borders could be laughed at precisely because they could not reach into the studio and change what went on the air. The trouble that came from closer to home was a different kind of trouble. It did not arrive from across the world. It arrived from organized groups inside the country, groups with names and offices and lawyers, groups that knew exactly which executives to call and which company owned the show. And when those groups felt that their deepest beliefs had been mocked, they did not simply complain. They applied pressure where it could actually do something. From the very beginning, the show treated religion as one of its favorite playgrounds. It made the central figure of Christianity into a recurring character who hosted his own local talk show and gave gentle advice to the townspeople. It put God on screen. It poked at the beliefs and rituals of nearly every faith it could think of, treating sacred stories the same way it treated everything else, as raw material for jokes. The men who made the show held to a simple principle in all of this. Nothing was to be protected. Every belief was fair game, and the moment one faith was placed off limits, the whole project would lose its nerve. That was the philosophy, stated plainly and often. Whether the show actually lived up to that philosophy is one of the genuine debates that surrounds it, and it is worth laying out honestly, because reasonable people land on different sides of it. The show's defenders have always pointed to the sheer range of its targets as proof that it mocked everyone without favor. By that view, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Mormonism, and the rest all took their turns under the knife, and no single faith was spared. Its critics have answered that the targets were not really treated equally at all. They argue that Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular, drew the show's most frequent and its most pointed attacks, while other faiths were touched more lightly or less often. There is evidence on both sides, and the disagreement has never been fully settled. What is clear is that the loudest and most organized backlash, the kind that actually reached the network, came overwhelmingly from Christian quarters, and one episode brought that backlash to a head more than any other. The episode was the finale of the show's 9th season, and it aired in December of 2005. Its main story was about the father character convincing himself that his drinking was a disease he could not control. But the device the episode used to tell that story is what set everything on fire. In the town near South Park, a statue of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus and one of the most revered figures in Catholic faith, appears to begin bleeding. The townspeople declare it a miracle and flock to see it. The episode treats the supposed miracle with deliberate crudeness, building toward a scene in which the Pope himself comes to examine the statue and delivers a verdict that is about as disrespectful as it is possible to be, concluding that the bleeding is nothing holy at all but simply the statue menstruating. For a faith that holds the Virgin Mary in the highest possible regard, the scene was not a light jab. It was an attack on something sacred, rendered in the most vulgar terms the show could manage. What turned offense into genuine fury was the timing, and the timing may not have been an accident. The episode aired on the eve of one of the most important days in the Catholic calendar, a holy day devoted specifically to the Virgin Mary. To air a crude joke about Mary on the night before the day set aside to honor her felt, to many Catholics, like a deliberate insult aimed at the worst possible moment. The sense that the show had chosen that date on purpose, to maximize the wound, gave the backlash an edge that ordinary offense would not have carried. The response was swift, organized, and aimed straight at the people with power over the show. A prominent Catholic advocacy group demanded a public apology from the giant company that owned the network. It went further and demanded that the episode be retired permanently, never aired again, and never released on home video, wiped out of existence. And then it did something clever. It identified a member of the parent company's own board of directors who was himself a practicing Catholic, and it called on him by name to break ranks and condemn the episode. The pressure worked, at least in part. That board member did issue a statement statement, calling the segment an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary, saying he found it especially troubling as a Catholic and pointing directly to the wounding choice of airing it on a holy day. He pledged to bring the matter to the company's chief executive. Around the same time, a senior figure in the country's Catholic leadership wrote to that same executive, accusing the network of extreme insensitivity. The complaints did not stay within the country either. Similar objections rose in other parts of the world where the episode had aired. For once, the organized pressure produced a visible result, though a smaller and quieter one than the offended group had demanded. When the network later re-aired the full 9th season in a marathon, the controversial finale was simply missing from the lineup, skipped over without announcement. The images from the episode were scrubbed from the network's official websites, as if to make the whole thing harder to find. Yet the network stopped short of the full surrender the advocacy group had asked for. It assured anyone who asked that the episode had not actually been retired and would remain available on the home video release. Over time, the episode quietly returned to rotation, and it kept its place in the show's library, even as it held on to one of the strictest content ratings the show ever carried. So the church's pressure had moved the network, but only so far. The episode was nudged out of sight for a moment, then allowed back. A domestic group with real influence had achieved something a foreign government never could: a temporary retreat by the people who controlled the show. And even that retreat was partial and brief. The whole affair reignited the old argument about whether the show was truly even-handed, and the argument cut both ways. Supporters of the show were quick to point out that this same advocacy group had stayed silent for years, while the show mocked one faith after another, and had only roared to life when its own beliefs were the target. To them, that silence proved the point. The group did not object to mockery of religion in general. It objected to mockery of its religion in particular, which is the very double standard the show existed to expose. The other side answered that the show really did treat Christianity more harshly and more often than the rest, that the Catholic Church absorbed a steady stream of the show's cruelest material, and that pointing to a few jokes about other faiths did not balance the scales. Both readings have real support behind them, and the disagreement says as much about the people watching as it does about the show itself. What makes the religious scandals so revealing is the contrast in how different faiths chose to respond to roughly the same treatment, because that contrast shaped the show's reputation far more than the jokes did. Set the Catholic reaction beside the reaction of another faith the show had mocked just as openly. A couple of years before the bleeding statue, the show had aired an episode that retold the founding story of the Mormon faith, walking through its origins with open, almost gleeful skepticism, complete with a mocking little refrain repeated throughout. By any measure, it was a thorough roasting of the religion's most sacred history, and yet the response from the Mormon side could not have been more different from the Catholic firestorm. There were no furious demands, no campaigns to have the episode buried, no letters to executives. The faith largely took it in stride. That calm held up over the years, even after the same two creators went on to build an entire hit stage musical around the religion. The church's response to that musical became almost legendary for its lightness, choosing gentle good humor over outrage. Same kind of mockery, two completely opposite reactions. That contrast holds a lesson the show seemed to understand instinctively, and it is the same lesson that ran through the celebrity feuds in a different form. The faiths that responded with fury and organized pressure became, in the public memory, the show's victims, the wounded parties whose sacred things had been defiled. The faiths that responded with a shrug or even a laugh robbed the show of the fight entirely and walked away looking confident and secure. The Catholic backlash gave the show one of its lasting reputations for cruelty toward Christianity. The Mormon shrug turned a brutal roasting into a footnote and arguably made the religion look stronger for being able to absorb it. In both cases, the show did roughly the same thing. What differed was the response, and the response is what people remembered. There is something almost ironic in how the religious scandals played out when set against the bigger threats that came before them. A faceless mob had forced a network to silence an entire speech out of fear for people's lives. A foreign government had erased the show from a nation of more than 1 billion people, and a domestic religious group armed with nothing more than letters, statements, and moral pressure managed to make a single episode quietly disappear from a rerun marathon and vanish from a website for a while. That is a smaller result than either of the larger threats achieved in raw terms, but it came from a different kind of power: the slow, persistent, legitimate pressure of an organized group that knew how to reach the people in charge. And it is the kind of pressure the show would face again and again in many forms across its whole life. Religion, in the end, is a belief, and a belief can absorb an insult and survive. A faith that has stood for centuries does not crumble because a cartoon drew a crude joke about it, however much its followers may be hurt. The wound is real, but it is the wound of having something sacred treated with disrespect, and faiths have weathered far worse. There is, however, a target even more sensitive than belief, one where the show's instinct to spare no one ran into the rawest possible nerve. The show did not only mock ideas and institutions, it mocked people, real people, and sometimes it mocked them at the worst imaginable moment, when they had just died, or when those who loved them were still in the first weeks of their grief. And that is where even some of the show's most devoted fans began to feel that the line had finally been crossed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The religious scandals showed that the show's fate often depended less on what it said than on who took offense, with one church mounting a campaign and another simply shrugging it off. Next, the show turns its jokes on real people in their rawest moments, on the recently dead and the freshly grieving, and finds the one line that made even loyal fans uneasy. Section 9. Too soon. The show had spent its life aiming at things that could take a hit. A church, a government, a corporation, a religion. All of these are large and durable. They are ideas and institutions, and an idea does not lie awake at night wounded by a cartoon. Even the angriest celebrity is, in the end, a powerful person with money and a platform, and the ability to fight back or simply move on. There is one kind of target, though, that has none of that armor. There is the person who has just died, and there are the people who loved them, still standing in the first raw weeks of their grief. When the show pointed its jokes at them, it ran into the one place where even some of its most loyal fans felt the ground shift beneath them, where the usual defense of nothing is sacred started to feel less like courage and more like cruelty. Death itself was never a problem for the show. In a strange way, death was one of its founding jokes. For years, one of the boys died in nearly every episode, killed off in some gruesome and absurd way only to return, alive and unbothered, the following week. Cartoon death was treated as a punchline, weightless and routine, something the audience learned to laugh at without a flicker of real feeling. That casual relationship with dying was part of the show's whole personality. The trouble began when the death in question was not a cartoon at all, when it belonged to a real person who had really died, and when the people grieving that person were watching. The clearest and most painful example came in the autumn of 2006, and it centered on a man the whole world had loved. A wildlife presenter, famous across the planet for his fearless joy around dangerous animals and his boundless warmth, had died suddenly and shockingly while filming in the water, killed by a stingray in an accident that stunned millions. He was the kind of public figure who seemed universally beloved, a man whose enthusiasm for life made his death feel like a personal loss to people who had never met him. The grief was real, and it was widespread, and it was very, very fresh. Only weeks had passed. Into that fresh grief, the show dropped a joke. In a Halloween-themed episode, the devil throws a costume party, and the guest list is a parade of the famous dead. Among the attendees is a man dressed as the late wildlife presenter, complete with a stingray protruding from his chest, a direct and graphic reference to exactly how the real man had died. The devil himself, the host of the party, scolds the guest for the costume, saying it is too soon, that the man has only just died and the joke is in poor taste. Then comes the reveal. The figure is not someone in a costume at all. It is the real presenter, arriving as himself, and the devil throws him out not for the tasteless costume, but for failing to wear one. The same party featured other recently or famously dead figures, a beloved princess, a murdered rapper, even a trio of notorious killers, all gathered together as the show treated the entire idea of mourning the dead as just another thing to mock. The reaction was immediate and harsh, and it came from exactly the people the joke had wounded. A broadcasting watchdog condemned the episode as grossly insensitive, arguing that it was unacceptable to mock a man's death so soon after it happened, while his family was still grieving. And then came the response that cut deeper than any critic could. The presenter's widow, a woman who had just lost her husband and was raising their children alone, called the joke cruel. There is no clever reading of the episode that survives contact with that single word, spoken by the person with the most right to speak it. The network defended the episode in the way it always defended such things, suggesting that regular viewers knew what the show was and would not be shocked by it. But the defense rang hollow against a grieving widow naming the thing for what it felt like to her. What makes this episode genuinely difficult, rather than simply indefensible, is that the show seemed to know exactly what it was doing, and built that knowledge into the joke itself. The devil's line about the costume being too soon is the very criticism the episode would receive, spoken out loud by the show before anyone anyone else could say it. In a sense, the show was anticipating the outrage and folding it into the bit, as if to say that it understood the line it was crossing and was crossing it on purpose. To some viewers, that extra layer was the whole point, a clever piece of self-awareness that mocked the very idea of being too soon, that questioned why some deaths are placed beyond the reach of comedy. To others, it was something worse than a simple bad joke, because it meant the show had thought carefully about how much this would hurt and had decided to do it anyway, then dressed up its cruelty as cleverness. Both readings are fair, and the gap between them is the whole debate. The meta layer offered something to argue about for everyone except the one person whose grief was the raw material, and for her, it offered nothing at all. The presenter was not the only real and vulnerable person the show turned into a spectacle. A couple of years later, it built an episode around a pop star who was, at that moment in real life, going through a very public and very painful collapse, hounded relentlessly by the press and the public. The show imagined her pushed to the very edge by that attention, and used the image of her breakdown to hold up a mirror to the audience itself. The real target of the episode was the media frenzy and the public's bottomless hunger to watch a famous person fall apart. The satire was aimed upward and outward, at the cruelty of the spectacle, and on that level, the episode was sharp and even insightful. The discomfort came from the vehicle. To make its point about how the world devours a suffering woman, the show put that suffering woman on screen and devoured her a little more. The episode is remembered as one of the bleakest things the show ever made, and the bleakness is real, because the person at the center of it was real and was genuinely struggling while it aired. The pattern continued into much more recent years, and it reached all the way to royalty. In 2023, the show built an entire episode around a royal couple who had stepped away from their family and moved across the world. Two people who spoke constantly about wanting privacy while also telling their story in books, interviews, and documentaries. The show never named them, calling them instead the prince and princess of a neighboring country. But no one could miss who was meant. It mocked the contradiction at the heart of their public lives, the loud and repeated demands for privacy from a couple who seemed never to leave the spotlight. It renamed the prince's real memoir as a single cry of complaint, a wailing sound, and built the whole episode around the gap between what the couple said they wanted and how they actually lived. The timing of that one carried its own weight because the couple had recently lost the family's matriarch, and the episode aired while that loss was still recent. Reports that followed suggested the princess in particular had been upset and overwhelmed by the portrayal, annoyed by it while refusing to watch the whole thing. Rumors swirled that the couple might even sue the show, though those rumors were dismissed as nonsense by people close to the situation, and no lawsuit ever came. And in a twist that complicated the whole picture, a member of the princess's own family went public to say that the episode had captured her perfectly, calling it hysterical, and saying the show had gotten her just right. So even within one family, the reaction split, some seeing cruelty aimed at grieving people who only wanted to be left alone, others seeing a fair skewering of two public figures who had built careers out of sharing their private lives. The episode reignited the oldest question that hangs over the show, the question of where exactly the line sits. That question is the real subject of this part of the story, and it is genuinely hard because both sides of it have a strong case. When the show aims at the famous, the powerful, and the hypocritical, its defenders stand on solid ground. Mockery of the mighty is one of the oldest and healthiest functions of comedy, deflating the pompous, puncturing the sanctimony that surrounds wealth and power and even death, refusing to let anyone declare themselves beyond laughter. All of that has real value, and the show does it better than almost anyone. By that argument, even the grief around a famous death is fair game, because the show is mocking the public ritual of mourning a stranger, not the private pain of the family. There is something honest in refusing to pretend, as everyone else does, that the dead instantly become saints. The trouble is that the argument gets much weaker the closer the joke gets to a real and undefended person. A grieving widow is not a powerful institution. A pop star in the middle of a breakdown is not a hypocrite who needs deflating. When the satirical target becomes blurry, when it is hard to say what idea or what powerful figure is actually being skewered, the joke stops looking like courage and starts looking like cruelty for its own sake. Shock deployed simply because shock gets attention. The show has always insisted that nothing is sacred, and it has applied that rule to death and grief as ruthlessly as to anything else. But the Too Soon episodes are the place where even devoted fans tend to part ways with it, because the cost of those particular jokes was not paid by the powerful or the deserving. It was paid by people who never asked to be in the joke and were in no position to fight back. The show itself has never fully resolved this tension, and the fact that it keeps building the too soon awareness into the jokes suggests it knows the tension is there. It seems caught between two of its its own instincts. The instinct to spare absolutely no one, and the quiet awareness that some targets cannot defend themselves. Rather than choosing, it does both at once, making the cruel joke and then commenting on its own cruelty in the same breath. That is either the most sophisticated thing about the show or the most slippery, depending on where a person stands, and the show appears content to leave the audience standing on whichever side they choose. What this stretch of scandals reveals is the limit of the show's guiding philosophy. The idea that everything must be open to mockery sounds clean and brave when the targets are governments, churches, and billionaires. It gets complicated, and for many people uncomfortable, when the target is a man dead only 7 weeks, with his widow watching. The show has lived inside that discomfort for its entire run, unwilling to give up its claim that nothing is sacred, yet returning again and again to the one kind of joke that tests whether that claim is a principle or just an excuse. There was, however, one more arena where the show would push harder than anywhere else, and the recent eruption there would dwarf all of these in scale and noise. The dead could not answer back. The grieving could only call a joke cruel and hope it stopped. But when the show turned its full force on the most powerful living person in the country, the response did not come from a widow or a watchdog or a church. It came from the seat of national power itself, an official answer from the highest office in the land, and it set off the loudest collision the show has ever been part of. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The too soon episodes found the show's one real limit. The place where its rule that nothing is sacred began to look like cruelty toward people who could not fight back. Next, the largest and most recent firestorm of all, as the show takes aim at the most powerful person in the country and draws a reply from the highest office in the land. Section 10, the political firestorm. By the time this story reaches its final chapter, the show has angered almost everyone it is possible to anger. It has lost a friend over a religious joke, turned a parade of celebrities into monsters, waged a 20-year war with a rival cartoon, been sued and mocked its own bosses, drawn death threats, been erased by a foreign government, enraged a church, and wounded grieving families. There is one arena left, and it is the one the show has lived inside from its earliest days, the messy and endless world of politics. For most of its life, the show's relationship with that world was defined by a single attitude, a refusal to take anyone's side. But in recent years, that attitude gave way to something fiercer, and the result was the loudest political collision the show has ever set off. A fight that reached all the way to the most powerful office in the country and drew an answer straight from it. To understand how strange that final fight is, it helps to remember how the show usually handled politics, because for decades, it was almost proudly even-handed. Its most famous statement on the subject was an episode about an election, in which the only two choices on the ballot were both presented as equally worthless. A contest between two terrible options where voting for either felt like a joke. That was the show's whole political philosophy in miniature. Politicians of every party were treated as worthy of the same contempt. Across its run, the show mocked leaders on the left and the right, skewered presidents from both major parties, and seemed to take a particular pleasure in refusing to let either side claim it as an ally. People across the political spectrum could watch it and feel that their own side had been spared no more than the other. That balance was a core part of its identity for a very long time. Even when the show first took aim at the man who would dominate its later years, it did so almost reluctantly. Around the middle of the 2000s, as a certain businessman rose toward the presidency, the show folded a version of him into one of its longtime characters, turning a familiar face into a blustering candidate running on anger and grievance. The show built a whole stretch of episodes around that parody, and then reality did something the writers had not planned for. The real election did not go the way they had built their season to expect, and the show was left scrambling to react to a result it had assumed would never happen. In the aftermath, the creators said something revealing. They admitted they were tired of writing about the man, that he had taken over everything, and that real life had become so absurd it was outrunning their ability to satirize it. So they pulled back. For several years, the show stepped away from heavy political material, deciding that the news had become its own kind of comedy and that there was little left for them to add. That retreat is what makes the eventual return so dramatic. The return came in the summer of 2025, and it arrived with a force much the show had been holding back for years. The new season opened with an episode that did not ease into politics gently. It threw the full weight of the show at the sitting president directly and without restraint. In the story, the president sues the town for an enormous sum after the townspeople object to religion being pushed into their children's school. The episode depicts him in ways designed to humiliate, including a recurring image of him sharing a bed with the devil himself. There is a grim significance to that particular choice, because years earlier the show had reserved that exact image, a powerful figure in bed with Satan, for a brutal dictator the world reviled. Placing the current president in that same role was a deliberate and pointed statement. The episode went further still, with crude depictions of the man's body and references to a notorious scandal involving a disgraced financier and the questions swirling around it. By the end, the town settles the lawsuit, agreeing to pay the president and to produce flattering messages praising him, one of which closes the episode with a strange, artificial-looking sequence of the president wandering through a desert. The response to that episode did not come from a critic or a watchdog or an offended interest group. It came from the White House. The morning after the premiere aired, a spokesperson for the administration issued an official statement attacking the show. The statement accused the political left of hypocrisy, noting that the same people who had spent years condemning the show as offensive were now suddenly praising it. It dismissed the show as something that had not been relevant in more than 2 decades, calling it a tired program hanging on by a thread, reaching for attention with worn-out ideas. And it insisted that no such program could possibly slow down the president's success. The remarkable thing about that statement is simply that it existed at all. The official communications office of the most powerful government on Earth had taken the time to respond, in writing, to a cartoon. The statement called the show irrelevant, and yet the very act of issuing it suggested the opposite, that the show had landed a blow significant enough to demand an answer from the highest level. The show did not treat that response as a reason to back off. It treated it as an invitation to go harder. The second episode of the season widened the target from the president alone to the people around him. The story followed a beloved minor character who loses his job and, out of desperation, signs up to work for the Federal Immigration Enforcement Agency, which the episode portrayed conducting aggressive raids. 2 senior administration figures were pulled into the parody for the first time. The head of the department overseeing those raids was depicted in a series of unflattering ways, including a running joke about her shooting dogs, a reference drawn directly from a real and widely discussed admission in her own memoir about killing a family pet. The episode showed her face appearing to melt, mocked her fondness for appearing in tactical gear for the cameras, and depicted the raid sweeping up anyone who looked a certain way, even storming a children's stage show and the gates of heaven itself, set to a crude chant about rounding people up by the color of their skin. The vice president, meanwhile, was reduced to a tiny figure, kicked around and ordered about, waiting on the president and the devil. Another character took on the mannerisms of a well-known conservative media personality. The administration was being skewered piece by piece, week after week. The reactions from the real people behind those parodies followed the same split the show had always produced in its targets, the same divide that ran through the celebrity feuds chapters earlier in this story. The department had responded with irritation, going on a friendly program to complain that it was lazy to mock a woman for her appearance, saying the attacks never seemed to end. She added that she had not actually watched the episode and argued that if the show wanted to criticize her work, it was free to do so, the implication being that it had gone after her looks because it could not find fault with her job. The vice president took the opposite approach. Rather than expressing anger, he leaned into the joke, posting about his own tiny cartoon portrayal with good humor and remarking that being mocked by the show meant he had finally arrived. One target treated the parody as a wound. The other treated it as a strange kind of honor. The pattern the show had revealed decades earlier, with monsters and hand puppets and fish, was repeating itself at the very top of national power. This firestorm stands apart from every other scandal in this story for a few reasons, and they are worth gathering together as the picture comes into focus. It is the most recent, still unfolding even now, with dozens of episodes left in the show's enormous new contract, which means the administration will almost certainly remain a target for years to come. It is the largest in pure scale, aiming not at one celebrity or one church or one company, but at the entire leadership of a government. And the response it drew was the most powerful possible, an official answer from the seat of national authority rather than from a private citizen or an organization. The administration sent mixed signals throughout. On one hand, calling the show irrelevant and faded. On the other hand, bothering to respond to it again and again, which told a story all its own. A program that was supposedly past its prime had managed to get under the skin of the most powerful people in the country, and it did so while sitting on one of the richest deals in television history, secure enough that nothing the administration said could touch it. That security is the thread that ties this final chapter back to everything that came before it, and it brings the whole long story to its quiet point. The show began as a cheap, crude cartoon made by two young men who decided, almost as a dare, that nothing and no one would be off limits. They held to that decision with a stubbornness that has cost them again and again across nearly 30 years. It cost them a beloved friend who left or was taken from the show after a single religious joke. It cost them episodes locked away forever after threats against their lives. It earned them the fury of celebrities, the contempt of a rival, lawsuits worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the erasure of their work across an entire nation, the organized pressure of offended churches, the grief and anger of families, and finally, the official condemnation of a government. By any normal measure, that is a long list of disasters, the kind of trouble that would have ended most shows many times over, and yet none of it ever changed the show. That is the strangest and most telling fact in this entire account. Through every feud and every scandal, the show kept doing exactly what it had always done. It did not soften after losing a friend. It did not retreat after the death threats, beyond the censorship forced on it by a frightened network. It did not learn caution from the lawsuits, the bans, the grieving widows, or the White House. Each new enemy simply became material for the next episode. Each new scandal, another story to be told and mocked and absorbed into the show's endless forward motion. The feuds and the scandals were never signs that the show had failed at what it set out to do. They were proof that it had succeeded. A show that decided to spare no one was always going to make enemies of everyone, and the long trail of fights it leaves behind is simply the cost of having meant that decision all along. The town it is set in is small, drawn in flat construction paper, peopled by foul-mouthed children and the foolish adults around them. From that tiny and absurd place, the show has managed to lose a friend to a powerful church, to be threatened by extremists, to be banned by a superpower, to be sued by media giants, and to be denounced from the most powerful building in the country. Few shows in the history of television have made so many real enemies in so many corners of the real world from such a small and ridiculous beginning. And it did it all by holding with quiet stubbornness to a single idea that it never once abandoned. The idea that everything must be allowed to be mocked, or nothing truly can be. The fights were never the failure. The fights were the whole point. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.